the head of experimentation at Yelp. And what that really means, it's a very product focused company. Yelp is primarily US based, but does have branches into different parts of the world. But generally speaking, what we're trying to do is connect people with local businesses. We're trying to connect people with restaurants, with services they need, with trying to see what are other people's perspectives on these businesses they'd like to use. And what we do with experimentation is we focus very deeply on making product decisions. We want to know that when we ship a feature or we make a change, that it is going to have not only a positive impact, but that we actually have a good sense of the size of the impact that we expect. This is a heavy collision between data and product-driven decision making. It is honestly, it can be challenging because there's a lot of people invested. When you have product and data working together, how you get them to think about these issues is really important. But today is a little more broad than that. It's not just discussing experimentation, it's discussing this idea of systems thinking. And systems thinking is something that you hear about in school, in business school, or you read it in papers, but it does have a lot of practical application to the work that we do on a daily basis. So I am going to, let's see if I can share here. One second, it's going to take a second. All right, so let me see if I'm able to share the desktop. All right, and can you let me know if you were able to see this?
Yes, we can.
Cool. All right. Doing this on this laptop for the first time, so there's always some surprising things that happen along the way. What I'm going to talk about today with systems thinking is specifically what it means for data and product. And it sounds, when you hear about like systems thinking, it's like, why would we care about something like this? The general idea, and something that is pretty agreeable to people when they hear about it, is that every day when we're making decisions, they're often very tactical. They're often very focused on responding to a fire over here, or an issue here, or user traffic is decreasing here, or we need to ship this new feature to do this. But what we're doing is we're often responding to smaller micro problems. And these micro problems are often consequences of much larger things happening, right? It's very similar to a concept in like in any economy, where when you hear the public talk about, well, we need to fix this in order to address this need for, like, we need to work on unemployment benefits, or we need to work on public assistance benefits, they're often responding to very like micro level concerns, when there's a lot of macro level things that are actually producing all of those micro level concerns that people are responding to. Very similar idea occurs in product. We often are responsive to very small issues, and we notice that this feature is breaking down over here. This feature broke 2 days ago. If you continue to respond to those smaller issues, which you do have to, right? You can't ignore them, but there's potentially a larger issue at play. Perhaps it's an unsustainable code base. Perhaps you haven't invested in engineering correctly. Perhaps your engineers don't quite understand what product is trying to do. There are these larger meta issues that produce a lot of the problems that we see day to day. And what we can't do, we can't solve big problems by fighting just those day-to-day issues. And I don't want you to get me wrong. We have to fight the day-to-day issues. We would be out of a job if we didn't respond to the necessary issues that are happening, if we didn't fix something that was affecting user traffic. But when we think about solving problems, we can't just do it at a tactical level. where we are trying to staff up to respond to, okay, this is the volume of problems we think we should observe over the next year, and then we hire to deal with that problem. We have to also, particularly in leadership, think about what is producing these larger problems, really at like a system level. And why I think this is so applicable to product in particular is we get very into the weeds focused. We're very, what are we going to ship this quarter or this month? And what is it going to do for our user traffic? But there's a larger story and larger set of problems that are happening when we think about users and when we think about product and we think about data. And the way that we approach these problems is really critical. You almost have to change your mindset, particularly in a leadership role. So today I'm going to have, basically I have 5 takeaways for you. I like to do this both in when I post publicly and also when I do presentations. I often think it's hard to retain more than 5 key points. Some people would argue it's 3, but bear with me when we work on 5 today. The first one is that we often think far too small and far too tactically in product and elsewhere. So I'll give you a good example. When I was in my first company, we every single day seemed to be fighting data quality issues. And in the data space and product space, data quality issues end up being pretty massive problems, right? If you're in product and you know that the metrics that you're using to make decisions on are not based on quality data, you're automatically going to trust those metrics and subsequently the data less, right? It's inherent just in how you build trust. Every day we were fighting data quality issues. Every day we had new issues crop up. And we created systems to respond to those, right? We built data systems that tried to clean the data. We built spot checks to make sure that only quality data was going into the system. But the problem with that is we weren't solving the larger issue, was that we weren't capturing data in systematic ways. So this was specifically in healthcare, where a lot of data is hand entered by doctors, nurses, whoever may be, transcriptionists who may be entering data that day. We weren't controlling data at the source. And so, of course, as they hired more doctors and nurses, as they hired other people without training and without standardization, we were fighting essentially a losing battle from the very start. We were never going to be able to keep up with the data quality issues that were introduced. So instead, we had to solve at the source. We had to think about how do we control data and standardization at the source. This also comes to bear in product. How many times, if you're familiar with product-based companies, have you questioned or wondered if the data being captured about your users is accurate? Right. This is a common issue, and it's in every company on earth that I've ever been a part of. We worry and wonder, like, okay, are we actually recording user actions in consistent and reliable ways? And we often end up getting frustrated because we continue to fight similar battles over time. Well, I don't think this user metric is right, or we missed traffic for these 3 hours on this particular day, and it's throwing our entire metric off. It can be very frustrating. And often what happens is we think small and we think too tactically because that's right in our faces, right? It is directly in front of us. It's a problem we have to solve. But if you solve that problem and you solve that smaller problem, which you do have to do, what you are hurting yourself in doing is not thinking about the larger issue at play. Why did we have this even happen in the first place? Was it the way we practice engineering, the way that we think about creating metrics? Should this even be the metric that we're using? These questions often, because we're so fast paced, often get left behind. Because as soon as we solve one problem, we're on to the next. And that's a habit in leadership, product, and elsewhere, is that we move on. We move on as soon as we've solved something. We're like, okay, well, we'll just deal with it later if it crops up. It becomes a snowball effect though, right? You have issues come up again and again and again, and that produces so much frustration, not only for you, but for the organization. So I encourage you, as you think about approaching this idea of a system, it's not some abstract notion. It's basically asking the question of, what are the larger causal issues at play that are producing these smaller problems that I'm responding to every single day? The second lesson is that we talk about product and data, and we're actually optimized to learn about the consequences of systems. So by this, I mean the way that we create data, the way that we create dashboards, the way that we make product decisions, we actually have created a system where we don't think about these macro issues that are at play. A good example would be, think about the number of dashboards that you might look at on a daily basis. Think about what those dashboards tell you. The dashboards are often focused on what's happening today or the last week, or how are we doing month over month. The dashboards often are telling you a very specific story about part of the user base. Our product decisions, we focus on a quarterly delivery cycle, in some cases a sprint cycle every 2 weeks. Basically, we are designed and we've created a system in which we respond to smaller scale issues. It doesn't mean they're not important, but it doesn't help us expose the broader problems at play. A good question that I ask in product companies is, we tend to focus a lot on everything about our existing users. But what about our users, potential users who are not yet part of our ecosystem? How are we reaching them? Can we measure things about them? How are we measuring and understanding our potential growth? What happens here is we've created models, review cycles, sprints, things like that. They're all designed to ship things quickly, which you do need to do in a product organization. But one of the major problems with that is, again, like point one, it incentivizes a focus on the short term, and it emphasizes a focus on the smaller scale tactical issues. Thinking strategically, I often find, is like, people talk about thinking strategically. The concept is not extraordinarily difficult. It's asking, okay, like, what are the larger issues at play? How do I have to create something that's sustainable, not just in the near term, but 1 to 2 to 5 years from now? But then we go and make decisions all based on the short term. In a leadership role, something that you have to push, because no one else is going to tell you to do it, is this focus on the larger system at play. Like, why does this matter? How does this actually produce the things that I'm seeing day to day? Because any change that we create in product, data, or elsewhere is often going to be a result of focusing on those larger systems, not the smaller tactical day-to-day issues. So what I've learned over time is we have a bias that when we think about data, right? Data is generally intended to inform, right? We want to learn about our users. We want to know what they're doing. We want to know how much growth we have in active user base. We want to know what the click-through rates are. We want to know what the number of impressions produced is month over month, whatever metric you love, right? What we don't often think about is what data we are not collecting or what data we are missing. If you don't think about the data that you're missing, you're losing out on potentially a very large addressable market with your users. So a good example would be, we have created systems and specific like engineering systems to measure everything about our existing users. We've optimized it. We've created this amazing thing that can tell us anything we want. But then you ask a question, what about the users that we don't have? What do we know about them? All right, when you think about a product and you think about product growth, this is often a question that people don't have a good answer to. It's often like, oh, well, this research report says this, or our user experience or our user research team says this. Very little data, very little, certainly not actionable data. And so there's often this frustration. If you've been part of a product company, people ask, well, we're not growing fast enough, right? Like we want our growth to be exponential, but it's linear or not linear, maybe worse. What do? The decisions and conversations that tend to result from that often are very focused on, well, we need to optimize this for our current user base. But solving that problem for your existing user base is not going to create something better that's going to attract new users necessarily. You have to break your habits in terms of what you're measuring. And so we become so obsessed with the data, but that data often actually has a bias that leads us to focus tactically, short term, without the bigger picture in play. So as you think about systems, ask yourself the question, like, what are we not measuring? What are we not thinking about? What do we not know? And that actually helps often expose the biases in the systems that you have in play right now. I'd encourage you to think about asking this question. What data don't we have? Rather than assessing what data we do have, it exposes a lot of insights, questions, things that you should be considering when it comes to trying to understand what's happening in this space. It's this focus on systems, this bias toward the data that we have, pushes us away from actually thinking carefully about potential growth in our user base. Something that deals with the practicalities of systems thinking is that if you're in any leadership role, you definitely understand that if you go into a presentation, you say, okay, we're going to focus on strategy. Immediately people are like, great. Like, it's hard to get buy-in for strategy. It's hard to get focused on these bigger issues at play. And so you have to think pretty carefully, how do you produce a group or a company or a division in your company that actually is addressing these larger systems? So we have a bias towards smaller problems. So solve the smaller problems. Solve them well, right? This is what, like, generally speaking, for better or for worse, what we're paid to do is to solve these smaller, shorter term problems. You have to execute. This is one challenge that I often have in connecting the classroom with the practicalities of business, is that we get too focused on frameworks. We get very focused on, theoretically, this is how it should work. But when you get into a business, it's just like, you have to solve problems. You have to execute. You have to move forward. So given that constraint, that you have to solve smaller problems, that you have to execute, you have to move forward, how do you think about solving a system problem? To me, it's all about how you package those smaller problems and those smaller wins for your organization and for yourself, for that matter. Let's say that you have a quarterly meeting or perhaps a monthly all hands, right? This is a very common thing across companies, is you'll have at least typically a monthly all hands for your division or your group or your team, whatever it may be. Help them actually understand that these larger things are at play. If you do a month in review or a quarterly review of the work that you're doing, think really carefully about, how do you look at these smaller projects and these smaller problems that were solved and help the team see that they're part of a bigger system? The first requirement for that is that you do it yourself. Something I do on a regular basis is I block time in my calendar every 2 weeks to sit down and look at the previous 2 weeks and think, like, what are the problems that we were solving? What was producing these problems, right? And often, like, over the course of years in industry, I've figured out that there are very few core system problems, right? We see a lot of downstream consequences, but the core problems at play are relatively similar across companies. So as you sit down and do this reflection, really force yourself to think, what are these 2 or 3 things that are producing so many of the issues that we see on a daily basis? If your product team made the wrong decision, if your data team has a data quality issue, if you had to deal with customers being unhappy with the service that was being delivered, ask yourself why this is. What's the bigger message? What's the bigger story at play here? Because there almost always is a bigger story. It just takes a little while to find that. But then use those monthly meetings, those weekly meetings, those quarterly meetings, whatever cadence it's on, to help the company actually understand that there are bigger things at play. Because the most important thing for solving these system problems is that you can't do it alone. You can't just wake up one day and be like, I'm going to solve this system problem. It requires concerted, consistent effort from many, many different people. And part of helping them buy into that is you have to help them see it. You have to help them see that there are these larger issues at play, that we're very down in the weeds, focused on fixing this fire over here and this fire over here. But if you help them think through this issue and think about this is a larger thing at play, there's a surprising amount of buy-in that you can get. It's actually really eye-opening when you see it play out in practice. What I want to do with the last point here is to focus on a case study. So this is something that has been written about a fair amount. I don't know if it's actually been published as like a business school case or not. I don't think it has, but there's a really fascinating story from some of the product owners for Instagram. Like Instagram has, been an incredible growth story, right? It is in many ways the fastest, along with WhatsApp, the fastest growing, and I guess TikTok these days, the fastest growing and maybe most impactful product that I've seen in a long time. When the product owners were looking at Instagram 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was 2.5 years ago, there was a question there was often a question about why they were seeing linear growth. So what had happened was Instagram, when it started, is a network, right? And networks, when they're operating well, tend to grow exponentially. So one user produces more than one user additional. And so you tend to see exponential growth. What they were seeing was a leveling out of where they were going pretty consistently, but linearly. And for a company like Facebook and a product like Instagram, that wasn't okay. So they asked a lot of questions about why. Like, why is this? Why are we seeing this? What's the actual issue at play here? And what was happening was they were not thinking about how to acquire new users as much as they were thinking about how to optimize for and create the experience for the users that they had. What they'll call it in different school and when they speak about it publicly is the adjacent user problem. So the adjacent user problem is basically focused on this idea that there are a lot of users who are very close to joining a product or using a product, but they haven't taken that last step. And so what does it mean to find what that last step is? For Instagram, and this is also true for many other product companies, they have users who might almost be there, who may be able to see the use case, but they need that final push. Maybe they don't understand the product well enough to download it, or maybe they do download it, but they don't become active. What they were seeing here is, though they were focused on saying, hey, our user growth is leveling out, it's growing linearly. What they were asking questions about, I think, and this is my read of their case, right? This is not necessarily me knowing the people at Instagram. But what they started asking questions were like, what's the bigger problem? What's actually producing this linear growth and leveling out that we're seeing? And it was exactly this. They captured it really well, this adjacent user problem. So how did they focus on it? They focused on learning as much as they could about who these users were that were very close to using the product or had high likelihood to use the product once they discovered it. And they tried to figure out how to get this product in front of them, how to shape the product to be appealing to these people that were on the edge and wanted to potentially use it, but just hadn't taken that step. This is an example of a larger system at play, right? This is an example of when you think beyond the scope of, okay, we don't have enough users. What should we do? Let's scramble. Instead, they focus very much on what is our larger approach here? What data are we not collecting? What users do we not understand? So they were asking questions about their total addressable market that were really, really insightful. And they weren't just about tactical day to day. How do we drive user growth today? It was saying, how do we think about user acquisition at a system level? Like, what is the system producing? Like, what are we missing? Who are we not paying attention to? And this exposed this problem for them. And once they exposed it, and once they focused specifically on here, their growth resumed growing exponentially. Of course, that's a bit oversimplified, I'm sure, but this is my public read of the information that they've shared. So these lessons that I've gone over, these 5 lessons to focus on specifically what it means to focus on a system, how to incentivize growth, how to really create impact for it in your company. It's just a different way of thinking. But it's not hard either. This is something that I want. Like, I don't want this to come off as this framework or this approach that's very difficult to employ. Often it just involves you asking the question, okay, what are the bigger issues that are at play? And a focus on these bigger issues is often extraordinarily valuable to you as a leader, to your organization, to any sort of product growth that you're hoping to engender and create. So with that, I think that is the end of the presentation. Do we want to kick it over to questions, or what would be the best approach here?
Eric, thank you so much for a very clear and wonderful insights into systems thinking. We have received some questions. Can I read them out to you?
Absolutely. Do you want to put them into the chat so that I can see the text of them, if that works?
That's sure.
Awesome. Cool.
Sure. So on the chat, we have one question here from Manoj Ravindranath. How a systems thinking approach can improve product design and deliver great user experience?
Yeah. So something that I would say is when we think about product design and user experience, we tend to be very focused on features, right? And this is just me being a part of a lot of product conversations, is we tend to focus on optimizing locally, right? We optimize very locally. Like, what widget should we have here? What color should this button be? What should this flow look like for user sign up? Something that we don't often do, but of course we have to solve those problems. We have to think, yes, we want this click through to be at a higher rate. We want the sign up process to have 2 steps rather than 6. Of course, that stuff matters. But something that I see happen when we think about product design and user experience is we tend to not think holistically, like, what is the overall experience we want users to come away with? So part of what I focus on a lot, with particularly around user experience, is with user experience research. Specifically, what do users think about our product holistically? Like, is it a positive impression? Is it a negative impression? Is it neutral? What do they walk away with? Do they walk away from a product thinking, I want to go back and use that? Or do they have a perception that the product is difficult to use and they're maybe a little bit hesitant about going back to it? I often think we focus very small, like, we tend to think small. We tend to think, did they like this feature? Did they like this thing that we shipped? Maybe. But the second question is, did this actually impact the overall ecosystem of the product in a productive way? That's challenging. It's often uncomfortable to ask that too, because something that we ask at the end of the year at Yelp and LinkedIn and other places that I've been is, what did we change this year? Right? We do a lot of experiments. We do a lot of micro changes throughout the course of that year. But for me, it's asking for every fiscal year, like, what difference did we make as a product organization? What do users have now that they didn't have before? And I think asking that question at a high level, like, are they generally more positive toward our product than they used to be? If they were, why? If they weren't, why? I think it can sort of shape how you ask the questions, and it can actually produce like a more strategic vision for where you want your organization and product to go.
Great. Thank you. And sorry about the noise.
No worries.
So, Eric, we have another question. How to position ourselves and our products for new potential customers? This is from Harshil Kulkarni.
That's a great question. So, how to position yourselves and products for new customers? To me, this is really focused on aggressively asking, have you essentially captured most of your existing user base? Have you maximized your existing users? And so a good way to think about this is look at your existing user base, assess who they are demographically, strategically, what do they care about, what do they focus on, what matters to them, and then really try to think, have you captured most of the market for your existing user base as they are, right? If your target market is those between, I'm just picking random years, 23 and 30 years of age, and in this particular location, it's really important that you understand, okay, how much of this market have I addressed? What's important is then defining, where are we going next, right? Where are we going next, and what downstream effect is that going to have on product? Very often when we think about trying to expand the user base, our goal is to go to the next biggest potential user base, right? If we've gotten the 23 through 30-year-olds, and now we're like, we're going to aim for 31 to 37 next because they're the biggest demographic. That often is very like short-term focused. It's focused on potential addressable market, but it doesn't necessarily ask a question like, is this good for the company or is this good for my product? I think it's really important to think at a high level, what do I want my product to be? Right? What do I want it to be for users? And then to think carefully about what users potentially are appropriate for that. This flies in the face a little bit of figure out what users want and then build it. Because what happens is we often produce, like, we end up building things to acquire users from different demographics, but it often results in like an incoherent set of products that don't necessarily make sense as a collective. When you ask the questions like, what do I want my company to be, or what do I want this product to be, and then who is that vision going to serve, that ends up being a really good orienting question for deciding on, who do you go after next? Who do you pursue? How do you pursue them? It allows a lot more tactical decision making to happen.
Thank you, Eric. We have a question from Manoj. What is the priority and sequence? Product thinking, design thinking, systems thinking?
That is a good question. I think I think we're talking about a lot of different types of thinking. Generally speaking, if you're focused on product, I actually don't like, and this is why I often avoid coming in with just the term systems thinking or design thinking or product thinking. I just prefer, like, are you thinking day to day, or are you thinking strategically and longer term? Like, very often when you attach like a time horizon to the problem, it often helps you, I think, make more effective decisions. So it's okay to think day to day. Like, I know after this call, I have to jump off and I have to go solve like 3 specific issues that just have to get done. But I also have meetings and time scheduled in my calendar to think about something that we're going to ship 2 years from now. And I don't think there's necessarily a right priority or a right order. It's more important that you just have them present in your daily life and schedule. So I try to make sure that at least every day I have a mixture of short-term thinking, like solving tactical problems in the near term, dealing with product issues, trying to ship a new feature, but that I also have time to focus on longer term problems, focus on organization building, focused on defining what the product vision is going to be for the company for the next 2 or 3 years, not just what I'm going to ship for this week. And so rather than thinking about priority and sequence, I think it's important to just have them present and make sure that you are allotting time for these different types of thinking and types of focus.
Interesting. Thank you. And we have a question from Mustafa. Can you give some real examples from Yelp or from experience on how systems thinking has affected a decision or a product roadmap?
Sure, absolutely. I won't go specifically into like, I think there's too many high leverage decisions that I can't fully discuss just at Yelp. But when we think about them, let's think about a large product company, and I think this is okay to discuss now. Like when you think about large tech companies, they're often trying to make decisions. A good example would be in sales and marketing, right? How do they think about their sales and marketing? How do they think about their acquisition funnel? Very often, the focus is on optimizing the conversion rates of that funnel, right? Where they want to get qualified leads to converted leads, to focus on what is the LTV of this particular user, this user base. And so almost all the decisions are focused on optimizing that funnel, right? Because they are trying to drive revenue, which makes sense. Revenue is why we have jobs. But often what I've seen happen from the best leaders and the best product thinkers is saying, even if we optimize this funnel, it's only going to solve a short-term problem. Sometimes it involves not trying to optimize the funnel that you have in front of you, but trying to like actually redefine what that funnel is. So who should be at the top of the funnel, right? This is so a good example would be a question of, over here, you may have very tactically focused, okay, I need to optimize this funnel and everything around it needs to take that paradigm. Over here, you may have the same, like, who's actually at the top of my funnel? Two different questions, right? Asking the question, who's at the top of your funnel, is essentially asking, who do you want to eventually convert to be users of your product? That question is something that often is not discussed. People are just focused on conversion, revenue driving. But longer term, the question of who's at the top of your funnel matters a lot. And this applies to product and users as well. It applies to almost any product, right? If you're thinking about conversion rates and sign-up rates from impressions to conversion to LTV, we often just focus on those numbers rather than who's actually converting. And I think the focus on who's actually converting and are those the people we want to be converting is an example of focusing at a systems level and not just at a tactical, like, let's optimize the funnel level.
Thank you, Eric. So I think that's all we had for the questions.
Cool.
It was great having you today.
Yeah,
and
thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you so much. And I would like to announce the winner for today before and also certificate of appreciation from all of us to you. This barcode here will take you to your Fame of Honor link on our website. So you can scan it and your video will be uploaded there as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And
yeah, and thank you for the invite.
Nice. Thank you. So that's about it. Thank you for joining us today. Tomorrow, again, we have another session at 8 p.m. by Irshad Rayyan. So I look forward to seeing you all there tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much.